Well, good afternoon and welcome to the PopTech Virtual Conversation Series. I'm Letha Filderman and we're delighted to have you with us today. As most of you know, I know many of you are familiar PopTech attendees, either virtually or in person. And for over a quarter of a century, PopTech has really been committed to exploring the intersections of popular culture, technology, and civil society. And I think today's conversation rests right there, really looking at a lot of the different ramifications of advanced technology that grows exponentially all the time and how that impacts all of our lives and, in fact, society at large. Today, we're really honored to host two amazing journalists from the New York Times, Charlie Warzell and Stuart Thompson, who have done some captivating reporting on the smartphone tracking industry, which I never really thought of as an industry as much as an annoyance, but it's kind of a juggernaut. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce my longtime colleague and the host of PopTech, Moran Surf, who will be guiding us through the conversation today.
Thank you, Lita. Thank you, Stuart and Charlie, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for being with us month to month when we talk about important topics. Everything is fragile on my end, internet-wise. In the spirit of today's conversation, we rely on digital communication for everything. So if things fall apart, fortunately, we have Lita who can help me take over. We have Stuart and Charlie who's been doing these conversations forever now, so they can do it without me. So I'll do my best to maintain a stable internet where I'm trying to talk about how internet is destabilizing everything. So let me ask the basic question. The two of you worked together on this privacy project for a while. How did it begin? How did the two meet? How did you convince the Times to let you do that? What's the behind the scenes story of how it came about?
Sure, I'll go first, I guess. So I joined the Times in 2019. Right around the start of the privacy project. So in terms of this was something that was kind of going on right as I entered, and so I didn't really have a lot of say in kind of coming up with that. But the general mission was something that I've devoted basically my whole reporting career to, which is the ways that the internet really continues to change and shape society, and the overall goal of the project was to really, as bland as this sounds, start a conversation around the issue of privacy. And what we mean by that is like developing a very sort of regular, normalized cadence of stories and exploration and definition of terms, and sort of almost like thinking of it as like a course to some degree. You come into a subject that you might not know tons about, and you continue to explore it and sort of advance and deepen the knowledge. And that's something that I think the opinion desk at the Times likes to do with lots of different subjects. We did one last year on inequality, and it's sort of these, coming at the same subject again and again from different angles, and a wide berth of contributors, people like that. And I sort of always been on the more explanatory side of internet and technology journalism. And I have often found myself coming up against the limits of what words can do sometimes, in terms of being, and even standard reporting, being able to talk to people and, get them to explain how something works, especially on an issue like privacy, where it is really, broad in a lot of ways. I think it's like climate change to some degree. It encompasses so much. It is, I believe the term is like a hyper object, right? Which is sort of defies easy categorization. And as such, people have difficulty really responding to it and knowing what to think and what to feel. And so, immediately, I think there was this kind of like a synergy, so to speak, between the work that I try to do in explaining these topics and investigating them, and the way that Stuart, who does that himself, but also has this amazing ability to present stories in a visual manner, to collect and make actual use and sense of large swaths of information. And when it comes to something like privacy, which is powered by data, it's very helpful to be able to illustrate these stories visually. And so that is sort of, I think, how we kind of came together and saw some opportunities to try to present this issue to people in a way that may be a little more arresting and a little more compelling.
Stuart, how do you end up thinking about privacy and meeting Charlie and coming to this project?
Yeah, so they did announce or just told us that they were going to work on this privacy project series, which originally it was called the Privacy Project as like a code word. And then we were trying to come up with like a better name. We couldn't, so we just called it Privacy Project. But they just told us that that's what we're going to work on. They told me, and I was like, what? Like, I remember writing about privacy like 10 years ago or something, like tracking and things like that. And I wasn't really convinced that there was a lot to say there, that it would be fresh and interesting, but it turned out to be extremely interesting and extremely fresh, because the industry, while we were not reporting on it for the 10 years in between, had expanded in pretty wild ways. And so did our ability to work with parts of the industry. So from my perspective, I run the visual journalism team and opinion, and we just try to use text and reporting and also all these other tools that we can get our hands on to tell stories in new ways. So our approach was just going to be using some of the technology that existed in a way that we couldn't, the 10 years before, to try to expose some of what was happening. So one of our early experiments was doing this facial recognition project, where we hacked a camera in New York and fed all the images into Amazon's facial recognition software and tried to find someone, and we did. A professor in the school was walking through the park at the time. We called him up. So yeah, we started experimenting with stuff like that, and we're always desperate for collaborators. So Charlie, I think I remember the first time he visited New York, and we got a coffee together, and we just had a really good energy, I think, in trying to talk through these issues and bring a fresh perspective to it. So when the Attract series started coming together, we had the data set in hand, and we just started working together on trying to understand what we might actually say about it as we were processing it and working with it and stuff like that. So I think that's how we got started.
So before we even go into privacy questions, I want to just make sure that everyone is on board with what you do. Can you tell someone who doesn't know anything, what is a privacy project? What are the goals? What is it aiming to do? And what should someone who just joined us, doesn't know anything about it, needs to know in order to be on board of what you guys are doing?
Essentially, it kind of exists now in the the atmosphere of a lot of the work that we do, in opinion. But when it was started, it was basically conceived of as a year-long project in which we would dissect the issue of digital privacy, and really from first principles, right? Not even necessarily saying that we've lost it completely or that everything is bad or that this type, our tools and our surveillance is bad. It's really just coming at this fresh, anew, exploring it. So and using all parts of the department. So our OpDocs team that does documentary filmmaking, our columnists, our slew of hundreds of experts and op-ed contributors, outside academics, investigative journalism, pretty much everything, just basically giving that as a writing topic to assign to people and having them go different ways with it, and just the real point of it was get a handle on where how much privacy we have in our digital lives in, I guess at the time it was 2019, and then work our way to the end of the year to try to make some judgments and come down and see where we really, what needs to change, who needs to be lobbied or pressured. And the pandemic came down right at the year end mark. And so we kind of had to shift our focus away from that grand finale project. But Stuart and I, for those who don't know, kind of capped it off at the end of 2019 with a 7-part investigative series using this massive trove of cell phone location data. We sort of reported out our findings, went to different places to discuss discuss it with people we found in the data. And at the end, the editorial board came down in the series with an editorial, asking for, some real legislation and a real sort of call to action from Congress to pass some comprehensive data privacy laws. And so that's kind of, sort of where the project was at and what it was trying to do. But it's now, as I said, it's kind of in the atmosphere of a lot of the work that we do. The point is never to open the door and then close it again. The point is to open the door and continue to live in that space. So that's, hopefully what we're doing with some of the work that continues to flow out of that.
I'm going to ask you in a second to answer the question, who needs to be lobbied, pressured, and all the things that you listed in your description of the project. I want to ask you one question that is a necessary thing to go over when we talk about privacy, which is, what is your answer to the following question? I don't need privacy, I have nothing to hide. Everyone who talks about privacy needs to have his prepared statement to what they answer when they hear this. I've heard many, many questions. I want to know, what is yours? When someone comes to and says, I don't need privacy, I have nothing to hide. Stuart, what do you tell them?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I should really have like a written response ready. I could just send to people. I think like the way I think about it is like, it's good that you don't have anything to hide, but some people do, and like those aren't crimes. They might just be like parts of their lives that they don't want other people to have a lens into necessarily for good reason. And in the cell phone data, it tracks where you move, and it's not cell phone towers. It's not like the nearest tower that pings. It's like literally your location within a few feet. So if you have an addiction problem, if you have a medical issue, if you are part of a community that might be targeted in some way, all that data is stored and shared and tracked and sold and so on, all tied back to you. And that's true of a lot of the data that we see. There's always something in there that is vulnerable for some group, and it's nice to be on the side of society maybe where you don't feel like a vulnerable person, but there's certainly people out there who do. So that's what I think of. I don't know about you, Charlotte.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's generally, a kind of you said, well, how do you respond to it? And I usually say like, it's bullshit, is what I say. Stuart listed most of those reasons, but yeah, I mean, these are like, this is a collective issue. This is not necessarily just a personal issue, like your data and information often reflects what is happening, not just to you, but around a lot of other people. And so I just don't think it's one of those situations where you can say you want to, it's okay by me and that there's no collateral damage whatsoever. I think that's false. I also think too that, it might be the case for you in the moment that whatever you're doing is totally fine. But, the way that these systems exist without any, real transparency inside of the collection, and especially with retention policies, how long this information is stored and where. I think one of the biggest issues with this is that times change, context changes, norms change, things that you didn't, have any need to be worried about, in 2018, in 2028, it might be something that you absolutely want to protect because maybe your context has changed. Maybe you now have a family. Maybe you do want more privacy. Maybe you have a different job. Maybe you have changed your political stances and it's made you, a target to a different group of people. Anyway, it's, the internet isn't static. We aren't static as human beings. And so I think it's just a real concern that this information, we don't really know exactly where it goes or how long it's there for. And so, yeah, I say bullshit.
Perfect. You summarized it well. So let me ask you that. So I assume that the audience of PopTech, the people that we have here, they're aware of the importance of privacy, the need for control. And I'm curious if you assume that the audience knows a lot about privacy, in the year and a half or 2 years now that you've been studying it and kind of learning the ins and outs of this, is there anything that you think that even someone who knows all about privacy doesn't know, something that you learned that you said, this is something that everyone should know that is not really yet kind of in the public conversation?
I don't know, Charlie, did you want to?
Sure. The thing that has surprised me, right, is I didn't really think that we would be doing this necessarily when we started reporting. I sort of, I don't really know what I was expecting the reporting to look like, but it ended up in a lot of ways becoming like digital advertising industry reporting. Talking to people who work at, digital marketing companies and sort of, like back end, folks who work with servers of data, or it wasn't really, it's not what I think a lot of people think of when they think of privacy, but those these ad tech exchanges and platforms like that are really sort of like the conduits for so much of this personal information, and really understand where this goes. And what was most striking to me, as someone who kind of knows that the internet is a bit of a Wild West when it comes to our information, is that a lot of the architects of this system, people who literally helped design parts of the ad tech ecosystem, people who work in it all the time, who are helping broker deals between apps and platforms, and see a lot of this money change hands in order to serve up programmatic or targeted ads or whatever. People who work in political campaigns, all of these people, nobody really knows fully what's going on here. Like, nobody has the bird's eye view of the system and can tell you, okay, the information goes here. It's it's sliced and diced here. It's repackaged, it's sold here. This is what people can see. This is what a bad actor could get, if they wanted on this server. There's like, it is really a black box, and everyone in this ecosystem seems to understand. Say you have a big sort of map like this, everyone understands one little piece of it, their piece and maybe a piece that connects, but nobody really knows the whole thing. So when you try to think of where does your information go, where does your data go, no one can really answer that definitively. And I mean, almost no one can answer that. And I think that is, to me, sort of the thing that broke my brain a little bit, because that's concerning, that there's really no grand oversight of this system. It was constructed on the fly, maybe not even maliciously, but now what we have is this system with no transparency, and data goes in and we don't always know where it goes out.
Yeah. I saw you nodding your head, Stuart, so I assume that you're just going to agree with everything. So I'm going to move to the next question to you, unless you're going to say, no, there's something else that he misses, Charlie, that is really a big thing there.
No, the only like meta point I might make is that when the thing that we encountered a lot was showing people, for example, we would find their path in the data, in the mobile phone data. So we would see where they traveled for several months at a time, and they had no idea they were being tracked, supposedly. When we showed it to them, the common reaction we got, which was very surprising to us, was like, oh yeah, I know I'm being tracked. But I think like when people have this expectation that they set many years ago, that they're being tracked, but they don't engage with it in a very deep way in terms of like what that actually means, like what data is being collected, where is it going, how is it being used. But we use that like understanding to dismiss privacy concerns like generally, because we're just like, oh, like I am being tracked. That is like the contract I engage in when I go online. And then they can't like, work up the concern over what it actually means to be tracked and have all their data stored and shared and sold and everything. The only other thing I'll add is like, we did try to map the ecosystem of advertisers and where information was sold and shared, and it's a network map, like sort of like a rat's nest of lines pointing in every which way, with companies with acronyms that I won't bore you to death with, but the system is so much bigger than we think of it as. Like Google and Facebook are tracking your data. There's brokers and data exchanges and portals and just like all bunch of companies, including mobile phone location companies who specialize in just that type of data. So yeah, it's much richer and bigger than I think people assume they know a lot about it, but tend to not actually.
So let me just take one kind of small question, because you mentioned it, and I want to follow up about people essentially not being surprised when they learn this thing. You, I imagine, were surprised many times by things you learned. did you change any behavior? Do you do anything differently now that you kind of know so much about privacy compared to 2 years ago?
Yeah, I'm a complete nut. So I have like 7 ad blockers. I use only the best browsers that are not owned by any company I don't trust. And I have like fake email accounts. I use password generators. So I went to the nines pretty early on in the privacy project, thinking I wasn't really comfortable with learning more and more about what's going on. But I still get targeted ads sometimes, and I just think like, how is it possible? I turn off every possible thing. And yeah, it's a leaky system, so they get it some way or another. But yeah, I've definitely become like a nut about it.
Charlie, are you also paranoid?
I'm not as good at being disciplined as Stuart with this. There's a lot of times, like the thing I try to tell people is like, you have to be really disciplined with this, and often you're not guaranteed, and I end up finding this dual thing happens to me the more that I read and research and report on this subject, which is that like my desire to become paranoid increases at the same time that I also feel it's kind of a little bit futile. And so I end up usually kind of keeps me at a stalemate. So like, yes, I've used certain ad blockers, but I also feel weird sometimes doing that, on free, journalism websites and things like that. Makes me feel a little conflicted because I do want them to continue to make money. But I wouldn't say I don't have a Faraday cage or anything here. I'm still kind of 2.0 instead of 3.0 on the privacy front.
And do you advocate that? So if your partners, your kids, your family asked you, is that a recommendation to people that listen to us right now? Or you said this is right now for us, but we don't think that anyone can actually live with those kind of really challenging rules. So we think that the definitely solution is going to come somewhere else.
Yeah, I think so. Like, you can't expect people to like prevent this tracking from happening. It's not realistic. You can take certain steps. I will say that like once you set up an ecosystem that it like blocks things, you don't really have to do very much. But yeah, like that is a big issue in the privacy community, would be that like giving people tips for protecting themselves is the wrong approach, because it should come from the top down, I guess, and change practices in a meaningful way. And to a big extent, you can only do so much, and you're still going to be tracked. And the companies are tapped into all your devices and networks to collect information. It's impossible to combat as an individual, but yeah.
And we're sort of in a space too where like, not to sound infantilizing to other people. Many people are very savvy with this, but I mean, there's still a number of people who like to tell me that they're really proud that they quit Facebook, and they just love that they just use Instagram now, and they quit Facebook on because they have moral objections to the company. And it's like, we're still in a position where a lot of people, even when they are sort of doing things and best practices, that if you don't have a fuller understanding of how this stuff works, or who owns what or whom, you can end up participating in things that you didn't even mean to.
So we addressed in the last two questions kind of the participation of the user. You reflected an extreme one. There's a kind of version that there's other parties in this complex kind of dynamics. One is the companies themselves that collect the data, and the other one is government or the regulators. I'm going to ask you about each of those for a second. First of all, you think the government should do? You said we're going to tell you who needs to be lobbied, who needs to be pressured. What do you think, kind of, if you had to give someone from the government, call for action with specific things to do, what would it be? And I'm going to ask you to also tap into that. Who does it right? If you can name a senator, congressman, congresswoman, someone who does it right already, that you say, hey, these guys are already kind of on the right track. Give me some names.
Why don't you go?
Sure. So it cut out just a little. So if I'm not addressing exactly what you wanted, just like yell at me. In terms of things that need to be done, I mean, I think right now, what we really need to look into are data retention policies. I think we need to, I think, true policies that address transparency, like where information goes. I think a lot of the sort of antitrust breakup big tech, conversations. I was part of the New York Times editorial board endorsement interviews with all the presidential candidates in 2019, around the same time Stuart and I were doing this project. And everyone was very excited who came through to talk about breaking up big tech. And it felt to me that it seemed very showy. I'm not exactly sure how unwinding Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp are going to meaningfully change the data collection system. I think that information can still, it doesn't really solve this big problem of transparency, of giving people the tools. I think first and foremost, rules that actually create opt-in as the gold standard, instead of opting out as the sort of gold standard in terms of user control over data. I think that is actually very key. I think what we're going to see in terms of any sort of solutions, and this goes beyond the privacy stuff, I think all the way to like content moderation issues, right? I think a lot of these things are going to be fixed by very sort of boring, procedural, small like changes. And I think like when you look at like the, I believe it was the House Oversight Committee, could be the Senate, when they brought some of these companies forward in hearings, they actually do the work, looking through the documents, looking in and seeing, how these companies' acquisitions are being done, what tools they're using to, increase their market share and block competition. And I think that all that is good, but I think you need to go into those weeds, lawmaker-wise. I think you need to go into the weeds on that through data policies, data retention policies, where this information goes. I think there needs to be like a real inquiry into the digital advertising ecosystem. I just think there's no standards in that world right now. It's barely regulated. And I think, a one way in for that is the fact that this system is very broken. It is Tim Huang, who's a scholar and deals with this sort of this stuff a lot, wrote a book called The Subprime Attention Economy. And he basically, makes a comparison to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the idea that, subprime mortgages were this kind of, crummy, toxic asset, and says that a lot of the whole sort of internet economy is built off of another toxic asset, which is this data that is actually often not worth a lot, is corrupted, is full of fraud in the market, and very, very opaque, and that there's this kind of bubble building there, and that if that does collapse, there's going to be a big problem. And I think that looking into it from that kind of perspective and thinking of it as a real economic problem, where we need to get some transparency and some standards in this industry before it breaks and kind of collapses with everything else, I think that's one way. Another way, I think, is to look at the fact that it's our political system is basically being built atop this right now. The most important thing you can have in political campaigning is this data. I think a lot of what we know and don't know about it is kind of confusing with, Cambridge Analytica, companies like that, is there mind control or whatever, but I think it can provide an urgency in this, which is to say we're layering our politics atop this broken system as well. The way that we campaign, the way that people can amass attention and power. And I think that's a huge way forward. So that's a lot, is kind of buckshot, but I think this idea that like we have to break up these companies is sort of obfuscating the real point here, which is that these ecosystems need to be regulated better in terms of what they do with their information, where it goes.
So Stuart, let me ask you about the third component of that to kind of follow up on what Charlie just said. So we heard a lot of things that should be done top down, let's call it government, regulators, investigation, inquiries, and so on. Is there anything that the companies that right now collect the data could do without being forced? That you think, if you had the ears of one of those ed tech agencies, and you could give them an advice on how to do it right while still making a profit, what would you tell them?
Well, there are some companies, especially in the smartphone tracking industry, that are better than others. So there's maybe some leadership within the industry. They basically rely on self-regulation, which doesn't mean a lot, but some don't sell, for instance, what we would consider raw data. So some do, and some make a lot of money doing that. But others analyze it themselves and sell the analysis from it. So I think Foursquare purports to be one of those companies. So that's like a step in the right direction, and that wouldn't require any major disruption or law. They could just make that decision. In reporting on the story, we did come across some companies that were sending location data through their through the smartphone apps that they were on to other companies, and in the process of reporting on it, they were like, "Oh, we're going to stop doing that. Please don't make a big name of us in the press." So I think there's some companies that may be engaged in some of these practices during more, gentler times, maybe when the spotlight wasn't on them as much, and some of them might want to reevaluate that now. And the core, as Charlie said, there's a lot of like. The weird two-sided coin of this thing is that the data is everywhere and it's this big industry and everyone's making a lot of money. But at the same time, the data sometimes can be really bad and not that accurate. And there's like this whole other side of it where like it's actually just junk and it's all for nothing. Like we're just giving up all this data and like doesn't actually like, a lot of it is not as useful as it's purported to be. So I think some companies might, assess whether they weigh the risks and the privacy violations against a new moral standard or something. I don't know that will go very far, but for some companies, they might might drift away from this as a business model and go to something that might actually provide value instead of just shipping data around the internet.
Under some kind of big friend DA of all the participants in this evening, is the New York Times doing a good job in not using private data and sharing it with others, or are the New York Times, your employer, also part of the problem? With the promise that I think we'll do our best to make it outside of the recording that happens here and the direct transmission to everyone outside. What do you think is the media? Let's make it about the media rather than about the New York Times doing here.
Yeah, I'm contractually obligated to share a link from our publisher AG, which I just posted in the chat. The Times did do like a reevaluation of their data practices, and I can't remember the exact details. They basically expunged some of the data that they were using for targeted advertising. Yeah, the media generally, newspapers generally, are very bad. That's been shown by a number of studies. I think one by Harvard, did some great analysis of this, and news sites were among the worst, but that has a lot to do with the concentration of who owns the news sites. They make up these portals that are big data advertising monsters, and then like shove a bunch of data around the internet. So maybe that'll change over time. It's maybe like a legacy problem, but yeah, I think the Times is doing great. So just read that article for AG.
Okay.
Let me just. I won't argue with that, but I will note that I personally get a lot of pushback from privacy advocates that it's hypocritical for reporters at these outlets to write about these stories when the companies they work for are also harvesting this information. I think if you look at the Markup, the publication that Julie Angwin from ProPublica started, that is very data privacy focused and sort of platform technological reporting. They're fantastic. Their whole goal is to design tools that go way out of their way not to use this information. I mean, I think all news sites could be doing better. I also think that it is often it's really difficult. I mean, there's always this tension in all of journalism, I would say, that you're especially technology reporting, that you're often using a lot of tools and doing a lot of you're basically reporting on things and you're like acting in that world at the same time. And I think it's really difficult. I think it's really worth acknowledging that. But also at the same time too, it's like, I find a lot of people get so upset at, the people who are acting in good faith that they, sort of negate, they don't look and see it like the broader picture. And I think especially when it comes to the way that I think about a lot of our reporting is that there is truly an awareness and understanding problem and like a literacy equivalent that we are constantly trying to elevate through a lot of these stories and through a lot of this reporting. And sometimes it does border on that. Like, are you participating in the thing that you're trying to, make people aware of? And I see that tension. I think it's like a very important one to keep front of mind all the time. And at the same time, I also think that, the biggest hurdle that we have to climb actually is people understanding this so that there is a groundswell to move forward and make progress on this. And if you don't have people who are, gonna actually view and see this, and you don't use those platforms and those tools to broadcast that, then you're just basically, it's a bunch of really well-meaning people shouting into the void.
Perfect, and I agree. You have a supportive, loving audience here, and you're not going to lose your job for anything. Let me take you for a second to one of the big stories that you reported on a few months ago, which was the story of the insurrection. You basically had data from Trump supporters who raided the Capitol. You kind of plotted them out. Can you tell us how this story came about? What were you kind of hoping that this story will tell us? Because this story not only talks about privacy and about the phone's data, it also plays a little bit into the conversation right now in the country about politics and so on, and kind of how did it happen behind the scenes?
Do you want to go, Charlie?
Sure. Essentially, I mean, as is the case with a lot of stories like this, a source contacts you and you follow your leads, evaluate them, see what happens. We're always looking, if anyone in this audience knows, like, we're always looking for people who can kind of come with the receipts, right? There's nothing better to illustrate this stuff than being able to present or show or be able to sift through, the actual data itself. And I think, when we saw that there was this, cell phone location data that was legitimate, that had this bird's eye view of this event, we published the story in early February, but we received it not long after the insurrection itself. And I think that there were two things that went through our mind on that. And one is that it was a very helpful tool to understand, what happened on a very chaotic day, a day that was captured by, thousands of individual smartphones and pieces of metadata. There wasn't that bird's eye thing. And the information that we saw actually showed this really interesting link between Donald Trump speaking on stage at the rally and people then leaving to go to the Capitol building, which was, maybe not exactly cause and effect, but it was really interesting linkage. So there's that part, which is helping to explain a story and helping to show something that happened that is crucially important. The other is that, this gives a very kind of juicy, for lack of a better term, news peg to this issue that we care a lot about and have been reporting on, which is this location data. And so I think the combination of those two, we spent quite a bit of time trying to thread that needle and sort of, show how this is an interesting and important tool to understand this day, but also, kind of showing all the really thorny and ethical problems that come with the collection and dissemination of this information. So, so the short answer is somebody came to us, but then the harder thing was, what do you do with it?
So I'm going to follow up with that one note. I mean, this story has legal aspects, right? There's been a discussion right now as to who did it, and your story acts both as kind of a bird's eye view, like you call it, like you kind of show the points of, you see people from above, they're first in the Trump rally, then you see them kind of moving towards the Capitol. It kind of, so is it also a part of the legal battle right now? Like, were you asked also to weigh in on the behind the scene of the conversations on whether, who did what and so on?
Stuart, do you? Sure. The answer is no. We've not. I mean, that's out of our purview. In terms of how we reported this story and how we choose to use the information, we're reporting on this for the purposes of, raising awareness on the issue of privacy, and we're trying not to break those rules ourselves as best as we can in the reporting. We were able to find lots of names and information, and even get in contact with some of those people. And the way that we chose, the standard we chose for the story was to only identify people who agreed to be named, because otherwise, what we were essentially doing was what we were, saying we feared, which is that people, going through these kind of databases, reverse engineering and broadcasting people's names out. Now, there's people who that's like ethically fraught, but because some people say, obviously there were laws broken and things like that. But I think, one thing we tried to highlight in that story is that, sometimes it was unclear if somebody was, was that person actually inside the building? What's the strength and reliability of that signal? Which shows you how, complex evaluating this information can be. So we don't have access to that information anymore, as we do with the reporting on these types of sensitive data sets. When we're done with the story, we don't keep that information hanging around, because it is a liability. And in terms of that, we see this as not only protecting our source, but our sources, but we also see it as protecting the integrity of the project and what we're actually arguing for, which is people to have a right to privacy. So no, we aren't participating in any kind of behind the scenes legal stuff.
Interesting. I did not know that you get rid of the data afterwards. Stuart, I'm gonna ask 3 more questions, short ones, and then I'm gonna open it for the audience to ask anything they want. So if you have questions, and I see that some are already in the chat, please get ready. We're gonna point it to you and ask you to participate. So Stuart, here is one tech question. I know that you're working on the visualization and you have all kinds of interesting ways of doing this. In the context of privacy, in the context of your projects, there's also sometimes, I imagine many times, need for a lot of technical knowledge. You actually have to understand what differential privacy is, or how did this data turn into this information and so on. How do you guys handle moments like that when you need to really understand the equation that someone uses to understand what's going on? Like, are you having terrible time with that, or you manage to do it easily, or you have people that I know of that are just like, what's behind the scenes of that?
Yeah, I think it's a lot like any other type of reporting where you go into a beat or a specialized area and you just try to get people to explain it to you until you feel like you can understand it and explain it back to them. So stuff like differential privacy, I did a lot of conversations with academics about just trying to think about privacy with this kind of data. Can it be anonymous and so on? And the other thing with this data is it's the simplest data I've ever seen. Like, it's so simple. It's like 3 columns in a spreadsheet, and sometimes it's a big database and sometimes you need cloud computing, but it is not that complicated. It's a latitude, longitude, and a date time, and an ID. That's like one of the stunning things for me. It's just like you could pass this thing around to any person with an Excel and like an online tool, and they can do what we did. It's not like especially complicated. We of course have used other larger data sets that did require more specialized skills and stuff like that. But yeah, generally it's not the most complicated data. And that's kind of one of the risks, is that you could just like email it around. We would talk to people sometimes, they would work at these companies in the beginning, and they would just have this data sitting around on someone's computer or some thumb drive that gets lost. And it's part of it is just how simple it is. But yeah, for understanding things, yeah, it's just like any other reporting, really.
Okay, so I saw one thing about the two of you, which is whenever one of you spoke, the other person nodded their head or smiled, almost completing the sentence. Here's my question. Is there anything you disagree on that you kind of fundamentally see the world differently, and you say, okay, we're going to have to wrestle until we figure out how to tell the story because we see the impact?
I had like the occasional disagreement. Maybe I was thinking around when someone also asked about this too, what the pandemic did to the marketplace. At the beginning of that, we were like, it was just a new thing that was happening, which was the pandemic was going on. People were freaking out. And these companies emerged, including Google, but a lot of other companies, with the data that we reported on, and now using it in like the public interest. Amazing moment for them, because now they can say, look at how useful our data is. We can show whether people are staying at home or whether they're traveling, and what that means for the pandemic response. And I don't know, like actually if we disagreed or not, but I just like didn't know what to make of that. Is that a good thing? Is that bad? And I generally was just thought like, it's bad because it's useful data collected in bad ways, and it's hard to reconcile that. I don't know if this was Charlie's anxiety or just collective anxiety at the pandemic launch, but I think you were like a little bit more willing to entertain it as like a once in a lifetime emergency, and that trying to get a hold of the pandemic in that moment was especially critical. And I'm sympathetic to that argument too. I just really don't know where I land in the end. But the Times has also used that data since to report on the issues. So how do we make sense of that? I don't know. It's sort of new territory.
Yeah, I would say that if we do have like, there are never disagreements, but it maybe like, one thing I feel like maybe I've noticed is I take the sort of our biggest critics on any story, on any single thing, are like privacy advocates, like people in that space who like are activists, right? So they're very unflinching in terms of what they want, how they think things should be, how definitions. Again, there's like I think Stuart alluded to it earlier, but like that idea that personal responsibility, or talking about anything in terms of personal responsibility, is irresponsible, right? And obviously as journalists, we come at this from opinion journalists rather too, like a different lens, but also somewhat the same. We're not like agnostic on this. We do have a point of view, but I think I take their criticisms maybe to heart a little bit more. Like I worry about them, and I sort of can sometimes get pushed off the path by them a little bit, and say like, oh, what are we doing? And I think that I find Stuart can sometimes be a little more like firm in his convictions there, and I think that that's actually helpful. But the pandemic really, I would say March and April really kind of, it kind of, how do I put this, like shocked me how much it changed my feelings in terms of contact tracing information and things like that. I'm obviously very skeptical of Apple and Google forming a partnership to have this thing, but at the same time, there was, I was like many people, was pretty terrified of the future and what was going on. There was so little that we knew, and I think any way that we can use these systems that were already set up to sort of help us, it seemed appealing, and I was a little taken aback by that. So I do think maybe, and I've sort of since reversed that, knowing more and more, and also knowing that we don't have a public appetite on that. But we did, I think, we probably we're sort of coming at that from different perspectives then, but most of the time we're in similar realm.
So let me ask you my last question, and then I'm going to turn to everyone's question, because I see that there's a lot piling up in the chat. In this one, you might say skip, but is there anything that you didn't report, that you kind of said, hey, we have this story, but for whatever reason, we won't report that because it will be too controversial, because it will expose too many people that gave us data, or so far everything that you encountered we know of?
Can't think of anything. I mean, there's story threads that we haven't finished working on yet, so there's more to come. I can't think of anything that we could say that didn't.
I think one thing is just in general that has always been hard is identifying companies, things like that, because data sets track back to a certain company, like there's, and it's not to say that one company is necessarily worse than the other, although some are. But in terms of like specificity, when you're trying to rely on a lot of people who have a lot to lose and who trust you to protect their information and their identity, I think it's harder sometimes to say like, this is where this information exactly came from, and like let's stamp a name on here, or names plural, or anything like that, and can't get into the specifics of that at all. But there are those types of things where you're sort of making a trade-off, and you're saying like, okay, in order to show this information, to use it, like we can't talk very much about the provenance of it. And I do think that has, that can have an effect, because it's always, when you're doing kind of like accountability reporting, it's always better to be able to say, these are the people. And we have done that to some degree, but I think there's always that frustration that you're, we have a duty to protect the people who trust us with their information.
What are you working on right now? What's in the pipeline? What we're gonna read in the front page of New York Times next week?
Charlie, anything you want to say about that?
Sure. We're constantly getting tips, and especially when there's like things like data sets or information that comes to you, the reporting on that can take a long time, not only just to understand what you're looking at, but also to understand how best to frame this, like what story is the information trying to tell, right? And there's always the easy way you can do that, which is just sort of here's this information, and then there's the harder and more elegant way, which is like, what does this say about about the internet we live on, about the economy that we've created for ourselves. And so something that we're looking into right now is sort of the architecture of the internet, like the web pages and things like that. And there's so much that's already known about things like tracking, et cetera. But I think what we're trying to sort of figure out how to do is to talk a little bit about like the way that the internet was kind of built, ad hoc, like slowly. We didn't know what it was going to be when we first started making it, and some of those design choices have left a lot of information vulnerable. And so thinking now about ways to try to illustrate that point, and maybe get people to think on a sort of like broader view about that, and whether or not there's any time to sort of retrofit it a little to protect people.
So here is our participants' chance of influencing the next story by asking the right question that will nudge Charlie and Stuart in the right direction. So let's open it for everyone to ask question. I think that it would work well if people could actually unmute themselves and ask the question in person rather than me reading them. And I'm kind of scrolling quickly, and I see Robert, your question. Do you want to unmute yourself and just ask it in person? And don't make the mistake I made. Just point out to one person and say, Charlie, Stuart, here's my question to you. So it will be easier to take it. Do you want to start, Robert?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I brought up one question, which was really about how the pandemic might be shifting what you're seeing in terms of both behaviors and practices, but also kind of what you think are kind of the underlying, policies that govern that are within play in discussion with government. But I feel like you guys kind of spoke to that. If there's more that you have to say about it, that would be great. But I guess maybe building off of that, I would kind of ask you, maybe, Stuart, like, what is, one of my experiences that many fewer organizations know what to do with this data than collect it. And so are there some examples of uses of this data that surprised you because they were more positive in terms of what they could achieve and support than you realized, maybe going in with a pretty critical, understandably critical frame?
There is some good work, especially with the smartphone location data in the academic settings. So some places, I'm trying to remember the exact analysis they were doing, but they were basically looking at where people live, where they work, and some like demographic connections there, and trying to make social justice arguments basically about like the way people are living that are hard to do without that kind of data, or much harder to do. So you could probably it's probably out there. I think a lot of that work's been published. There's been other cases where it's like, oh, I didn't know that they were doing that, but like maybe that's useful. So in one case, like if you have a map system in your car, that's not like Google Maps or whatever, it's just like built in. Your companies, all the companies, car companies are getting into that business and using that data and reselling it, repackaging it. And it goes to these other companies that analyze it, but they do like interesting things with it. Like they'll look at the use of a road and then determine live down to like a broad area, even though they know where they live, but they'll analyze it down to like a county or a zip code or something. And then they'll be able to assess like who's responsible for maintenance of that road was one example they gave. So like, if you just think of it like, well, that's so weird. Like people have maps in the cars, the data's being collected, stored, it's analyzed. And like, there's just so much of that going on that we don't know about. So I'm sure there are like positive use cases. And that is the main argument that companies will give, is that there's like all this great stuff you can get from this data, and just think how protected the privacy is. So it's not a problem. And COVID is like the best moment that they've ever had for PR, because now that's the first thing at the front of every report or any kind of question they're going to get is like, look at all the great we did around helping people understand the pandemic. Which is like, I don't know, I find that kind of scary or disturbing or something, but it is the reality for sure.
I see that there are questions from Michael Shield, and I see Jill Shield, so I'm not sure if it's coming, but I'm curious if you want to unmute yourself and ask it.
I think the question about turning off your location data was already answered. But another question I have in relation to Robert's query is about South Korea, where the cell phone companies, not the tracking data, not turning on your location data on your cell phone, but just the cell phone companies were able to identify where people were at a given time and use that for contact tracing, and very effectively. How that might be a trade-off with lack of privacy when it's everybody in the country is subject to the same rules.
Mm-hmm. It's a very compelling use case, especially when it is done properly. So a lot of the early contact tracing programs were pretty quickly designed and had the potential to be pretty leaky. I think I saw something. I haven't been following it as closely as I probably should have, but I did see something that I don't know if it was Taiwan or South Korea, but there was definitely some individuals using or the government was going to store that information a little while longer than they said or something, and a bunch of privacy advocates said, well, here, of course, like this is what always happens, right? There's overreach. So I think that's an issue. When I never ended up really writing the story that I was going to write about this because the pandemic was so chaotic in the early months, but I think that what it really came down to more than anything was that in the United States, just the political will for a contact tracing program like that, just there really never was even close to enough to get something really off the ground in a way that would make a lot of sense. Maybe county by county. I know in Missoula, Montana, where I live, they used a program only with people who opted in after they had tested positive. If you wanted to not have a nurse call you, you would use this thing and it would, kind of track where you are, and it would send you a message every couple of days. And I think on like the county level and things like that can work. But when you're talking about a national surveillance program, I mean, it didn't really work in most countries, but especially what I learned in my reporting is just, I mean, it is sort of antithetical in some way when you give people a choice in the American experience to want to have, this kind of tracking. And I think that that's really interesting. Like, it really says something, like, it's almost like the kind of polling that people are always wanting to get, right? Which is like, do people really care about their privacy? And it's like, well, we use all these products, we must not, right? We love Facebook, we love, Amazon, we love all, whatever. But, all that stuff is, again, opt out, not opt in. And in this sense, we kind of gave people an opt-in to save your life potentially, right? And people weren't willing to trade their privacy broadly. I mean, it never polled well. So it's really a fascinating kind of way to look at, especially in this country, but broadly across the globe, other than, some areas that did it and did it well. I think a lot of people, really do value their privacy, or at least value being able to say no and have the power to say no.
We're at the end of the hour, so I want to almost wrap up, but I know that, Bill, you had one comment that I missed in the above. Can you repeat that? And Charlie, I'm going to ask you the final thing before we end up. So, Bill, to you.
Well, I was wondering, can literacy and awareness, and for that matter, government regulation, solve these issues or address them well enough? Or do we need alternatives, and what kind of alternatives would there be? I guess I'll address this to Stuart. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm going to address that to Charlie maybe, but I'll take a stab. I mean, yes, we've seen that government intervention can work. And I think I could design a system, kind of to Charlie's point about opt-in, where it would be totally privacy protective and it would solve tons of these issues. Will the government put those in place? Probably not. And what we're seeing is some of the government regulation in Europe is actually not very effective, even though there's big documents written and big laws written. It ends up being a lot of notices you have to click on, which isn't really, the notice and consent model is a sham as well for privacy. So there maybe has to be a deeper moral reckoning with the systems that we've created, and maybe figuratively exploding some of the the mechanics of the way the internet works. Some of the other alternative models that are kind of interesting to me is just Apple being we make money from devices and software and hardware, so we don't need data, and then being sort of the weird strength of monopoly is not that they're a monopoly, but they have a huge reach and huge potential to affect change. If Google and Apple decided that they were going to be on the right side of privacy, they would have a massive impact in a day. They could have huge impact. And we've seen that did make a difference over time with changes to app regulations. So, and notices. So on phones now, you will get reminded if you're sharing your location frequently. You can't even ask for permanent location right away. You have to ask, I think, 3 times or something for someone to share the location before you're allowed to ask for it always, if I remember that correctly. So those are some changes that they put in place over time that seem to make a difference. And I think if those companies took it seriously, they could probably have a big impact without having to go through the government. But I don't really do anything bad.
Here's my last question to you, Charlie. Are you optimistic about where we're going with privacy? Do you think things will get better, done well, or you think that we're spiraling down to a worst case scenario coming soon?
I don't know that I believe in a worst case scenario with any of this stuff, because I think there's a way in which I'm kind of morbidly optimistic in the sense that it can always get worse. So there's no there's no judgment day where we flip a switch and we all become zombies, right? I don't really believe in that. Am I optimistic? I'm going to say I am not all that optimistic in some senses. I do think we will, to the last question that was asked, it was sort of can we solve this? And I think that that's the wrong frame. I think we don't solve these types of problems. We solve them incrementally, and then new ones appear. And I really believe that. One thing that we always lose sight of, everyone, I think, self very much included, is how new a lot of these issues are. The iPhone changed everything in 2007. We haven't been dealing with it actually all that long for the sort of mammoth disruption that it created in the data industry. We're still figuring these things out. So do I think some of these issues that feel really thorny now, will they get sorted out? Yes. When I look at it, not to be all insufferable about it, but a lot of these are just problems of unregulated capitalism to some degree. And I think that is kind of the engine towards this. And I do think that there needs to be a lot more of these guardrails in the way that these things are designed, and the way so I'm optimistic we'll solve some of these short-term problems, but I think our the nature of technology is it's often deployed with really good faith uses, and it ends up having a lot of adverse negative effects, and we scramble to fix them. So the way that I would end this for myself is to say, I think we have a very pivotal few years in terms of people really understanding what is going on with their information, what is really happening with the tools that they use all the time, what the effects of all that information collection are, who it helps, who it hurts, who it makes rich, etc., who it keeps down, and then I think there's a finite amount of time in which we can learn from that and really kind of get our hooks into some of these companies and people and pressure lawmakers and things like that. And I do think there is a period of time which if we don't act, it will just entrench itself and it won't be fixable. So I don't know when that point of no return is. I am optimistic, though, that we are, as a society, learning more and caring more about it.
Stuart, Charlie, everyone, thank you so much for the time. I know we went a little bit after the 1 hour, but it was so fascinating for me that I couldn't let you guys go. I hope we get to do it sometime in the near future, such that all of our GPS locations would be in the same place. With that, I'm turning back to the final words. Thank you so much, really. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks to both of you. You've been super generous with your time, and wow, the breadth of knowledge is really amazing. And I think we're going to keep you on the hook here to update us periodically, because I know we've all been pretty captivated by your work, and that will continue to be the case. So thank you again, and thanks to everybody for joining us. We've had a wonderful evening, and we'll see you all soon, I hope. Bye now.
Thank you.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.